accused of stifling national liberation movements to deal with terrorist methods. After the 9th of September, things expanded, and the organizations which we were facing were supported by international organizations such as Al-Qaeda, which was set up to fight against the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. As things stand today, in Iraq and Syria, ISIL was opposing the existing regime. In fact, there are more than 100 terrorist organizations in the world, and even the League of Nations in 1931 looked for solutions and didn't find them. We, in our country, in Russia, where I was the leader of a working group in the State Duma, we worked on a new law to counter terrorism. To counter terrorism because terrorism, that is broader than just fighting terrorism. Counter-terrorist operations were taking place, and therefore, in order to take preventive measures, we defined terrorism with a new definition as an ideology of violence and the practice of actions against the bodies of power of local government through threats of violence in order to achieve their ends. The ideology of violence has already made it possible for this violence among people. We have been able to take measures. We have been fighting through space and time, and the ideology of violence has made it possible for us to have a presidential decree against terrorism and a state policy, the army and the police and everybody else involved to take educational measures of the kind we've heard about. And today this is enabling us, to a large extent, to prevent this horrible phenomenon, which is terrorism. I think that if this definition were to be adopted internationally by other states too, the problems which have arisen, which came up in Paris, we're talking about the cultural values of other religions, Orthodox, Muslims and others. We could have prevented this because these people from radical Islam have been using the caricatures, the cartoons, as an excuse for what they were doing. But it's very important here to emphasize, as previous speakers have done, the need for a definition. What are human rights? Here we're looking at two types of limitation on human rights: the period of an ongoing counter-terrorist operation, movement in time and routes, ban on meetings, the sale of certain types of goods, etc. And the restriction on the privacy of correspondence, telephone conversations, the monitoring of computer communications, etc., including the creation of secret camps and torturing detainees. Now, how do we find the golden mean? This is a very serious problem, and it should be one of the questions that we should be making recommendations onto the international organizations, including the United Nations. Today, the coalition against international terrorism has become significantly weaker. We found this at home. Following the events last year, there has been no military cooperation between the West and Russia. And this did include special services, and this is, of course, abnormal, and this should be corrected. I think that a global understanding of the threat of terror and combining international efforts to fight it should prevail over political considerations. The convention which is being put before us, that we're looking at, I think it needs to be seen as an initiative, a recommendation to the organizers, the United Nations, because counter-terrorism by the UN is very weak. The United Nations ought to be taking a more active position. Many years ago, we established the organization which has now stopped working, the World Anti-Criminal Organization, and in 1990 we saw that Interpol the right to carry out investigative activities and is playing the role of a post box. It's getting information and passing it on. But if that organization were to make changes to its constitution through the UN, Interpol, to give Interpol activities on the basis of existing states which would have force in the framework of the international structures, special forces to carry out the fight, then they could deal with international terrorism. And then the fight against terrorism will be much more effective. I was talking with a representative of the Secretary General of Interpol, and he spoke, and this is what he said. But some efforts have to be made. Of course, nobody wants to assume extra functions, extra work. But we've seen the figures, we've heard the figures in the report, and they force us to be active and to work, even if it's not very good for us personally. Thank you.